Hey everyone, my name is Shelby Astle. I am guest lecturing today. I'm going to talk about educating kids about sex. I'm going to focus a lot on parent-child communication about sex because that's kind of my area that I'm passionate about. But also then we'll talk a little bit about school-based sex education. So if you have any questions throughout this, feel free to email me. My email is on the screen. Or you can follow me on Twitter. I just post resources there, so it might be helpful to stay in contact if you do have questions or are interested in this topic. Okay, so let's start off with talking about what is sexual health, because I think when we talk about think about talking to kids about sex, it's usually about promoting some aspect of sexual health. So this definition is from the World Health Organization, and I really love it. They define sexual health as a state of physical, mental, and social well-being in relation to sexuality. It requires a positive and respectful approach to sexuality and sexual relationships, as well as the possibility of having pleasurable and safe sexual experiences free of coercion, discrimination, and violence. So this big picture of having a healthy sexual relationship with yourself, physically, mentally, socially, respectful, pleasurable, safe, consensual sexual relationships. I also really like this definition from a group called the Act for Youth Center of Excellence from New York. And they define sexual health by the things that you might understand or know how to do. So sexual health, I am comfortable with my body and my sexuality. I can talk effectively with peers, family, and partners. I know my body and how it functions. I understand the risks, responsibilities, and consequences of sexual behavior. I'm able to recognize risks and ways to reduce them. I know how to access and use healthcare services and information. I'm able to set boundaries when it comes to sex and sexual relationships. I act responsibly according to my personal values, and I am able to form and maintain healthy relationships. Now, looking at if these are our definitions of sexual health, if these are our goals for our youth and kids that are growing up and learning about sexuality, just think about your own experience and what things may have contributed to building one of these components of sexual health, and what things maybe didn't help with developing these skills, or even did the opposite of not make you negatively impact these components. And when we think about that, there are a lot of different systems that impact someone's sexual well-being. So you see in the middle of this drawing, there's a kid and their sexual health, or in this picture, sexual self-concept, is the idea that I'm healthy, I am knowledgeable, I can make sexual decisions, I have knowledge, all those things we just talked about. If any of you know and are familiar with Bronfenbrenner's human ecological model, this is kind of based on that, the idea that multiple systems influence our development, whether it's sexual or just general development. And these systems definitely play a part in how we develop sexually. There's some examples in the drawing. So we have media, religion, school of peers, and family. We're all interacting with those, or most of those. Most of us are interacting with a lot of these regularly. And then there's also the bigger cultural scripts that kind of is the umbrella for everything. So these cultural ideas that we hold, this idea that guys always want sex, or getting an STI is the end of the world, women don't have sexual desire or pleasure. These ideas are perpetuated through our culture and just how we talk about and make meaning of sex. And then just the messages that we get from these other systems. So what is the school telling us in their curriculum? What are my peers telling me about sex, or what should or shouldn't be happening? What's my family saying, either implicitly or explicitly? What am I seeing on the media? Am I thinking that pornography is realistic and normal, or that the people, how they have sex on TV is how it's supposed to be? Am I getting messages from a religious group or like spiritual affiliation about purity or abstinence? All these things just influence how we develop sexually and like how we make meanings of sex. And for me, in my research and what I'm passionate about, I focus a lot on the parent aspect of things. So my idea is that, yeah, we're coming into contact with kids are coming into contact with all of these different systems that influence how they develop sexually, but having a good relationship with a caregiver that can provide answers to questions and provide modeling for like healthy sexuality and healthy sexual beliefs, I would argue that that can provide like a really meaningful foundation when kids are dealing with all these other sources outside of the family. And of course, the family can be influenced by these sources as well. It's like kind of all like a pot of everybody influencing each other, right? And none of these are like in a vacuum and they're not linear. But parents can really like provide a lot of support when learning how to develop sexually when dealing with all these other systems. So I want to focus on research that helps parents be the best sexual communicators that they can for their kids. And I want to acknowledge that like not everyone who's listening is a parent right now. And not all of us have like good relationships with our caregivers or parents, but thinking about how we can influence and do our part better for the kids today, whether you end up being a parent one day or if you're working as an elementary school teacher or someone who teaches classes in the community through extension or a therapist. Like think about all the times growing up when you like had someone give you like someone like said something that affected how you thought about sexuality. It definitely wasn't always your parents, even peers, like being a good example of sexual communication with peers is also important, even like though we're not like young adolescents developing sexually right now. But so just as we're talking, I will tailor this lecture a lot to parents, but understand that I'm also talking about your role, like in a professional role or just like socialization role if you have nieces or nephews or will be interacting with any adolescents or kids. Like, and honestly, a lot of us didn't get great sex ed, so we could like do like use some reparenting ourselves. So with all this in mind, I want you to think about just like connect for a second with maybe the teenage version of you or the child part of you that got some sexual messaging. Like, how did you feel? Thinking back to times when you might have felt shame or guilt or confusion. I know for me, like, there was a lot of fear around sexuality and that there was no information. I remember the first time that I kissed somebody, I had like got like a pimple on my lip the next day and thought that I had herpes because I was just like misinformed about that. I didn't know like what genitalia was supposed to look like, so I was like worried that I was abnormal, even though like someone could have easily like taught me like what anatomy is supposed to be like, and it would have caused like helped me not have like nearly as much distress. Just lots of fear, and like anytime something sexual came on TV, it was like scary because I didn't have the tools to like process and deal with it. So if you've ever had like feelings like that of just confusion or like, am I normal? And that doesn't have to be as a kid or as a teenager. Like obviously we like there's a lot of misinformation about sex out there. So I think a lot of us have questions about like what's normal and what's not. So connect with that part of yourself. And also I want you to think about what you want for the kids that are out there today. So maybe think about a niece or nephew, your future kids, kids in your classroom, kids in your community. Like, what do you want to do as an educated role model to help them develop those healthy sexual characteristics that we talked about earlier. And I want you to keep that in mind as we keep talking. So some of this is from the article that you read, the Flores and Barroso article, which I love. Just going over some basic facts about parent-child sexual communication that is just fancy speak for talking to your kids about sex. And I guess I should mention too that when we say like talking to your kids about sex, usually that doesn't like encompass actually sex. Like sometimes it definitely does, but like a lot of times it's just like, what does my body look like? Like that's not really talking to them about sex. It's just talking to them about anatomy or physiology or even like romantic relationships. Like it's not always about sex. So we kind of lump this whole, like the things that you might think would be awkward kind of fit into this whole like parent-child sexual communication, talking about sex, even though it's not explicitly always about sex, but it's usually like related in some way. So some basic facts to lay the groundwork. We know that most parent-child sexual communication happens between mothers and daughters. Mothers also do take on more talks. Some research has shown that like they talk more with daughters and sons than fathers. So mothers are doing a lot of the sex educating. Most sex talks happen like one time, like the birds and the bees, like, oh, we got to sit down and get this over with, give you all the information you need for the whole rest of your life. Or they're like, we talked to you when you were 10 about how babies were made, and then I guess we'll talk to you when you're 16 about like using condoms. So that's like the episodic, like they're not really continual. Most people just have like, we'll talk when we need to. Most of this communication is general instead of like fact-based. So it'll be like most common things people report hearing from their parents are don't have sex or wait to have sex or use protection, which doesn't really give like a whole lot of information. Like it's not like parents are sitting down and being like, okay, here are some options for birth control. Here's like why this one is effective, why this one might not be. What are your feelings about these different birth controls? Do you feel like you know how to use them? It's usually just like use protection. So really general communication instead of fact-based info. And it's not usually like not applicable, like it's usually not focused on the kids' personal experiences. Like, oh, like you had sex, like how was it? Like, are you okay? Like, do you want to talk about it? Or like, oh, you're dating somebody, like how do you feel about like what's going on? Like it's not like, it's just like, don't have sex and use protection. Most parent-child talks were authoritarian. So if you remember the parenting typologies, the authoritarian, like authoritarian is very much like I am the leader. Like as the parent, like I will tell you what's right. The parent and these conversations were like directed by the parent. They didn't really have like a go-between. Like, oh well, like in my experience, like my friend said this and so I thought this. It's more of just like the parent like giving a lecture and didn't let the kid really like give their point of view. Most of this communication is also indirect. So parents don't like come out and say what messages they're trying to get across. There's like innuendos, like we talk about the birds and the bees and like weird names for body parts or names for sex, like doing the dirty, like we use things like that instead of like just saying what it actually is. Humor or scare tactics, storytelling, analogies are used to talk about sex instead of being more like clear, which could lead to some miscommunication or maybe the kid not realizing that you're talking about sex. But like parents like report wanting to do better than their parents, and I think culturally we are like getting better, and most parents do believe that talking to their kids about sex is their parental responsibility. But there are like lots of barriers to talking to your kids about sex. Some of these might be reasons that your parents like didn't talk to you about sex, or maybe your parents overcame these barriers and did talk to you about sex. So both parents and kids don't want to start these conversations. So parents are like, oh, well, when my kid has a question, they'll come to me. And the kids are like, well, it's my parents' job to like start talking to me. So there's like this kind of like a standstill. And kids don't always want to start these conversations because in one study they found that kids were afraid that it would cause strain on their relationship with their parent, that parents wouldn't trust them. Like if I'm asking questions about sex, will my parents like stop trusting me and think that I'm having sex when they don't want me to? Believing that parents aren't like open to listening to them and their concerns. These things cause kids to like not want to talk to their parents about sex or bring it up. For parents, there's lots of barriers. So they might not have like sexual knowledge and not feel like they can answer their kids' questions. Low self-efficacy, like, can I even talk to my kids about this the right way? There's also fear that if I talk to my kid about sex, it will encourage them to experiment, and I want to like maintain my kid's innocence and not like expose them to sexual things when I think they might be too young. So age is a big barrier, and just feeling awkward in general stops parents from talking to kids about sex. But good news, or maybe, yeah, some news. These barriers, like the idea that talking to your kid about sex like leads kids to experiment or maybe have like risky sexual behavior, isn't true. I want to validate that worry. Like that makes sense that parents would be worried about that. Like if I put this idea in my kid's head, what are they going to do with it? But actually what research finds is that talking to your kid about sex leads to better outcomes. So for adolescents and young adults whose parents did talk to them about sex, they waited longer to have sex for the first time, had better ability to negotiate for sex with the partner, like, hey, let's use a condom. They had better ability to talk with sexual partner about like sexually related things, reported more self-efficacy using contraceptives, and reported increased use of protection during sex. So talking to your kid about sex actually has some pretty good outcomes. And a note on waiting to have sex longer for the first time, it's not necessarily like a positive or negative thing. I know that lots of parents are worried about kids having sex too young, so they're like, hey, this is a good thing. But let's remember that it's not timing of sexual activity that is like a measure of health. It's more of those things we talked about earlier, like feeling like you had a consensual, pleasurable experience, or that you had like efficacy to make good decisions and there wasn't coercion, stuff like that. So some of the research we'll talk about, a lot of the research looks at outcomes like wearing condoms, waiting, like how old you were when you had sex for the first time. But just a reminder that those aren't like necessarily like showing that kids are sexually healthy, because there can be a kid who's totally abstinent but has like a lot of fear and anxiety about sex and doesn't feel like they have knowledge or that they respect their body. So just a note on that. But this is the research that talking to your kids about sex has really good protective outcomes. So if any of y'all had that worry, like, great news, you're like talking with your kid about sex is good. So takeaway number 1, I want you to go home with: talking with your kid about sex prepares them and gives them the knowledge to make healthier sexual decisions. It doesn't encourage them to experiment with sex. Next thing I want to talk about is what I like to call self of the parent. So it might sound weird in the therapy world. When therapists are being trained, they focus on self of the therapist. So it just means that like a therapist's personal values, personal experiences, maybe trauma, like things that they've gone through and their perspective, their identities. So like if I have a more privileged identity, like all those things are going to affect how I am interacting with the client. So there's a lot of work on like self-introspection and examining values and being really cognizant of how those are interacting with the work that they do as therapists. And I really want to apply this to parents. So parents who have like certain value sets around sexuality, or just like fear and anxiety about sex or have experienced a sexual trauma, like those things are all going to affect how you're able to talk to your kid about sex. So, like, we can't just be like, everyone talk to their kid about sex, because each parent is so different and each parent has like their own personal experiences. So working through as a parent your own anxieties and fears is really important, or looking at like, like why is it so hard for me to like think about telling my kid like what, like the word penis, like why is that so scary for me? I had a professor once who told me that she was feeling really anxious about talking to her kids about sex, and when she was like a new mom and she had a newborn baby, and she would like, when she was breastfeeding him, she would be like, one day she'd like practice giving him like sex talks, even though obviously like newborns aren't like retaining anything. It was for her to work through her own anxiety about like talking to this little human about sex and knowing she'll have to do it one day. So she's like, you have a penis and two testicles. And she's like, sorry, I'm petting it like a dog, but that's like, well, like as a newborn, and that's how she like worked through that. Other parents I know like say the word like vagina in the mirror like over and over until their anxiety is down. So whatever you need to do to like work through, you can read books, get educated. If there is something like a sexual abuse history or trauma, it could be a really good idea to see a licensed therapist and work through some of that. That's just a great resource. Obviously, that's up to you and your situation. So takeaway number 2, examine your own personal values and feelings about sexuality. Practice overcoming anxiety by working with family members that you trust or with a professional. Because it's when we do that that we can like be effective at like talking to our kids about sex. It's just being self-aware of where you're coming from and what challenges you might have. All right, how do we talk to kids about sex? The golden question. When we ask adolescents and young adults what they wish adults would do, or what they did do when they were talking to them about sex as kids, they just want talks like overall. Like the biggest thing that these people are saying is that they wish their parents were open, honest, comfortable, supportive, and non-judgmental. Like this theme of support, unconditional support is comes up a lot in the research. Kids just want to know that you're a safe and like safe space that they'll get reliable information from. And I think as we're connecting back to our child and teen selves, that rings true for a lot of us. It's just like wishing there was a safe, non-judgmental source that we could have gone to for questions. And if you did, then like resonating with like, yeah, that was really like impactful for me. So no shame, no scare tactics, and no lies. So the whole thing, like, they're like, oh, I just told my kid that babies come from storks when they asked me because, like, it was just easier than talking about penises and vaginas and sperm and or test tubes, like, but when we tell our kids lies about sex, like, they're gonna find out eventually, like, your 5-year-old is gonna find out that they actually don't come from storks. Like eventually they will find out, and that message to them is that like, oh, when I talked to my dad about sex, he like lied to me, and I don't really know if I want to go to him for information about sex again. And it just, if we can be honest with our kids from the get-go, like there's just, that just builds the relationship so much more. Like, oh, I know I can ask them questions. Like, oh, they don't lie to me when they tell me like where apples come from when I ask that random question. Like, it should be the same with sex. We have a lot of anxiety and fear about sex in our culture, but just being honest and telling the truth is really important. And same thing with scare tactics. And scare tactics are things like meant to like induce fear and like kind of scare kids away from being interested in sex or doing sexual things, because we want to like have that control over their behavior. But it's the same thing as lies. Like It makes me think of Mean Girls when he's like, if you have sex, you will get pregnant and chlamydia or whatever and die. And these teens know that there are plenty of their peers who don't have, like, haven't died and have had sex. So they kids on, like, and in research also bears out that, like, kids see through the scare tactics and also just see you as an unreliable source. So don't tell your kids that babies come from storks. We'll talk about a good way to answer that question in a couple slides. And I will talk about shame a little more in depth in a couple minutes. We want to encourage learning. Let's remember that kids and teens are, like, especially young kids, when they ask, like, where babies come from, like, they don't recognize that it's sexual or awkward. And it's really, yeah. Um, they don't, like, have that social meaning behind it yet. They're not like, oh, I'm, like, getting curious about this weird thing. They're just, like, learning how the world works, and that's a super normal part of their development. And so encouraging learning instead of stifling it is really important. We don't want kids to think that they shouldn't be learning about the world around them, and we can answer their questions in age appropriate ways. Really important, as I mentioned before, like, not a lot of child focused discussions are going on. Mostly parent child communication is, like, lecture-y. One study found that discussions where parents only focus on negative consequences of sex, belittle child's opinions, or that are harsh and demeaning are actually associated with earlier sex in teens. So parents who might try to be like, no, like, you're not having sex, like, let me tell you why, and all the bad things, and I don't really care what your opinion is, that they're probably doing it because they don't want their kid to engage in sexual activity, but it's actually doing the opposite. And it's a lot more effective to have conversations with the kid from their perspective and be a source of information. So being like if your kid comes home and asks you what a virgin is, oh, like, tell me what you know about that already. I know one story of, like, one kid asked a parent that question, and they're like, Mom, what's a virgin? And they're like, okay, it's my moment, I will give you the sex talk. And they, like, went into so much detail about sex, and then the kid's like, looks really confused, and then the mom's like, oh, maybe I should ask where they got that from. And they were like, oh, I just saw it on the extra virgin olive oil. So, like, asking kids for some context is good to know, like, what they already know on the topic. Or like, oh, like, what did your, like, friends tell you? Or, but not in a way of like, tell me who told you that word so that I can, like, call their mom. Like, it's about, like, oh, just give me some context because we want to talk about it, and, like, getting their input. And when you do give them information, like, asking them, like, how do you think that, like, fits in with what you're going through right now, or is that helpful? Like, talking to them and asking for their perspective instead of lectures is more effective. Go into as much detail as you feel comfortable with. Usually parents are, like, lean towards giving too little information, and kids can usually, like, handle more information than you think they can. Not going into, like, crazy detail, especially for, like, younger kids, but, like, you can tell them, like, how a sperm and egg come together instead of a stork. Like, that's fine. And with that, like, their kids are never really too young to know things, unless it's like, if your kid is saying, like, really adult, like, crude lingo about sexuality, it might be a sign of sexual abuse. But if kids are asking questions, they're old enough to know, and there are age appropriate ways that you can, like, answer their questions. And feel free, definitely share your sexual values with your kids. And you can do that in the context of whatever question they have. Like, don't feel like you can't share your sexual values. That's, like, an important part of parents' role that is different than, like, school-based sexual education. Like, parents do have, like, the right and the opportunity to share their values with your kids. So if your kid asks you what a blowjob is, you can tell them what it is and then be like, how do you think like giving blowjobs fits in with our sexual values? And if you've talked about the sexual values before, the kid could be like, well, I know our sexual values are about like consensual sex that's safe. So I guess as long as they're using a dental dam and like both partners agree to it, I think it's okay based on our sexual values. Or it might be like, oh, how does the blowjob fit in with our sexual values? And the kid is like, well, all I really know about our sexual values is that like no sex before marriage, but I don't really know like where a blowjob fits in between there. Like, and then you can be like, okay, well, let's talk about it. So there are like lots of good opportunities to like share your values as a parent with your kids and like don't feel like that's off the table. I will say, just remember, I think sometimes we forget that kids don't have to share the same values as us. So if our kid has different sexual values, then you like just be aware that you can't change who your kid is, and just I don't know, just that like just a message of like be aware that like you can push your kid away if you're like causing distance between you. Like if a teen and is feeling resistance from you because you're trying to change their values, like it might be better to preserve the relationship, but you can share your values and they can know, but you can preserve the relationship over values, if that makes sense. Okay, so let's go back to shame. So shame is this feeling of like I have low self-worth. Like it's not like I did something bad, it's I am something bad. I really like the way Brené Brown defines it. So she says it's the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. So feeling I am bad, I am a mess. The focus is on self, not behavior, with the result that we feel alone. Shame is never known to lead us towards positive change. Shame is a tactic that we use a lot when we're talking about sex, unfortunately, and then sex turns into this really bad, shameful, dirty, gross, sinful thing. And it's just not an effective technique for talking to kids about sex. Like there are ways to talk about like what behaviors might be appropriate and inappropriate without telling kids that they're gross or bad. So like childhood masturbation is super normal. Kids are getting to know their bodies. They're like I don't know, like kids explore, like babies put their feet in their mouths or they explore what their hair feels like. Like those are all normal, but childhood masturbation, exploring genitals, is also super, super normal. But a lot of parents worry that that's like a really perverted sexual behavior. So that's totally normal, but we can make kids feel shame, like saying like if we're like telling them that they're bad for doing that like really natural behavior, instead of being like, oh, like have some quiet time in your room. And if your values are that like masturbation isn't appropriate, we still can like teach those messages without sending the message that you're bad for doing this. Like we don't need to use shame when we're talking to kids about sex, and it actually just pushes kids away and makes them have like a not positive self-image about sexuality, when like sexuality is just a part of the human experience and we don't need to shame it, and we can each make our own sexual decisions. So stay away from shame as a parent. Don't tell kids that they're bad, or especially for like asking questions. Like kids should never feel bad about asking questions. They should feel like they can come to you and ask questions. So communicating about sex happens verbally and non-verbally. So I know that there are things that we can think of, important adults in our lives saying out loud, like, oh, that's gross. Like that is a verbal message. A non-verbal message would be like not talking about sex as a non-verbal message, like the absence of communication tells us that there's like something wrong with communicating. Or one good one is like We call penises, I heard one family call them Tinky Winkies or something like that, which I think is a Teletubby. But like not naming your genitals in the like anatomically correct ways sends a message like, oh, there's something different about this body part that we're not allowed to say the name of it. Not really sure why, but like I can say my fingers, my elbows, my nose, but like something about this body part is like off limits. Or my parents get really uncomfortable, like they like tense up when I ask that question. And so I'm not going to ask them a question again because their nonverbals, like their body language, showed me that it's not a good thing to talk to my parents about, and I don't want to make them feel uncomfortable, and it was awkward for me. So, or like my family is notorious for when we're watching movies with like sex scenes or even like depictions of non-heterosexual relationships. My parents will be like they'll like audibly like sigh or like tense up. And that message, like I was saying my whole life, was that like there's something wrong with these when they didn't have to say anything out loud to me. I knew that they like felt uncomfortable about something just because of the way that they non-verbally were reacting to that media. So let's watch a video. I practiced this and I can share it with you. Yeah, let me just make sure that is set up. Okay, so let's watch a video. This is from Empower or Educate and Empower Kids, which is a resource that I highly recommend. So as we're watching this video, I want you to pay attention to the nonverbal cues and the verbal cues and what they may be meaning to this kid. And maybe be prepared to adjust your volume. I don't know how it'll turn out on your end. So here we go.
Mom, where do babies come from?
So every month, the female ovary releases an egg down through the fallopian tube, like a chicken coop. The egg can become fertilized by sperm. And when it's fertilized, it's called a fetus. And it kind of looks like a little alien. Meanwhile, the mommy is growing and becoming fatter. Then you start having contractions, and the contractions are your worst nightmare. Then your water breaks and there's fluid everywhere. And then you have to put your legs up in these stirrups. A whole bunch of people get to see things that are private to you. It hurts so bad. It's a living nightmare, really. And there's blood, and then a baby comes out. And a baby is born. Yay!
Mom, where do babies come from?
I'm so glad you asked, babe. A baby is made when a mommy and daddy get together. The mommy has an egg and the daddy has a seed, and the seed goes inside the egg, and then a baby is made.
So it's not a stork?
No, it's not a stork.
Okay, it's going to apart.
Okay.
Talk to your kids confidently with age-appropriate answers. Find information and educational resources like 30 days of...
Okay. If we were in person, we'd have a discussion, but I love that video. It's funny. I don't think that your whole neighborhood will like suddenly fall to pieces if your kid asks about sex, but I think those reactions are like parents are still like, ah! Like there's still this reaction of like, no, I've been dreading this moment. Some nonverbal messages in like that first talk when she's like, sperm, ugh, like that's like feeling like that, like, oh, well, something about sperm is bad, like, okay. The reaction from other people and the mom of like, oh, like dread, like, yikes, like you asked that question, like, no. the message that talk is probably different than like how she would answer other questions, like, oh, like, quick, let's like go to your bedroom and talk about this in private because this is like something about this topic that you asked me about is bad. Like that's the message. But I love in the second video how it's like, oh, like, I'm so glad you asked. Like, I'm ready to answer your question. Let's just answer right now. And she answers the question, and the kid's like, okay, cool. Like, let's go to the park. The kid isn't like, oh gosh, like, I'm going to ask this big question that's going to, like, destroy the neighborhood. Like, it's just like, I have a question, Mom. Like, just like you would ask, like, hey, Mom, what color is that tree? Like, oh, that tree is brown. Like, okay, sweet. Let's go to the park. Like, that's how normal and comfortable, like, our sex talks should be, and paying attention to the nonverbal messages that we send in our body language. And again, that might take some practice. And if you do have that reaction, because sometimes it is just like a gut reaction of like, oh my gosh, and even like, oh my gosh, I'm not supposed to be like giving body language that I'm freaking out, but I'm actually freaking out and I think I'm messing up. Like, it's okay. Like we'll talk about ways that we can like talk about and make repairs when that does happen. Just pay attention to the nonverbal messages that you're sending when you talk about sexuality. So the biggest thing your kid should take away from talking with you about sexual topics is that my parent caregiver is a safe and trustworthy resource that I can turn to when I want honest, non-judgmental, and supportive information about sex. And our kids will make their own sexual decisions, and we're just there to answer their questions and support them and share our values with them too. So takeaway number 3, don't ever make your child feel bad for being curious about sex. Be honest, open, and share your values. So when should we talk to kids about sex? Early and often, like just start from really, really young. And we'll talk about some age appropriate like topics, but it shouldn't be like, oh crap, my kid is 11 and is probably like gonna go through puberty soon. We should probably talk. Like, it should start from birth, like early and often. It should be a regular topic of conversation that's just normal, like talking about their favorite toys or what they did at school that day, like, and working on that as like a family is, or as like a parent is a big thing, and it's just something to practice. So talking early and often, the birds and the bees talk is not a good idea. Like, talking to your kids about where babies come from, like, yes, do it, but like the cultural idea that like we have to have the talk is not good. Like, how do we expect our kid to have like one talk about how babies are made when they're like 9, and then like grow up to be like a fully functional sexual adult with all the like healthy things that we talked about at the beginning? Is just not gonna happen. Like, they need some extra, like, as you're growing and developing and having new experiences, you're gonna have new questions, and so one talk isn't gonna like work out, and it doesn't set up the expectation that you can come to me for questions and I can initiate topics with you. So no birds and bees, as in don't have like the sex talk. Have lots of sex talks their whole lives. So let's talk about, I'm going to set this up with an analogy. So like, thank you for your patience as I work through this analogy. I was just thinking about like how we teach kids to drive. Like, there's like things to know, like when you're driving, like, oh, put it in drive or reverse, or like how to start the ignition, or what like signals to use as you're driving, or what the street signs mean. And kids, it's not like kids live in a vacuum and then all of a sudden like learn how to drive when they turn 16. Like, kids are being exposed to how our world manages traffic all the time. So even as like a little kid, like, oh, hold my hand and look both ways before you cross the street. Like, kids know, like, oh, okay, like cars come down the street and I, as a pedestrian, need to like watch and like just be safe to make sure I cross when there are no cars coming. Kids watch movies about cars all the time. Like, they know how cars work. They know cars are just a part of our lives. And even if kids don't actually drive when they're 16. Like, they are definitely still walking places or riding bikes or like getting around somehow. So kids, like, we like foundationally build up like how traffic works. Like, growing up, I didn't like care. I knew what like the stop sign and like the lights on the traffic light meant, but I didn't care what like a lane merge was, or like kind of like some like Animal Crossing, or not Animal Crossing. I've been playing that game. Like Deer Crossing or whatever. Um, like, they like build up things, and then when they're ready to drive, the analogy here is that like sex is when you start driving. I know I don't love sex analogies, but I just think that like it's the same with sex. We should be building up our kids like this foundation of like, you're always going to exist in a world where traffic is happening and where you have to know your place as either a pedestrian, a cyclist, a driver. And it's the same with sex. Like, we're born with bodies that have like sexuality, like we're sexual beings from the beginning. And if we just like ignore our sexuality until like we turn 16 or whatever, like, it doesn't set us up for success in the future. So my point with sex in this analogy is that like, we set up baby steps for people to learn like from a very, very young age things about their body and sexuality that is the foundation for how they can use when they actually are sexually active. Or if they're not sexually active, there are people who never have sex and they're happy pedestrians and still can have like, you don't have to be sexually active to have like a healthy sexuality and the things that we talked about at the beginning. A lot of it does come from like our internal view of ourselves. So that's my analogy. I don't know if it was helpful. Stow that away. So talking about the building blocks that we start young with kids to help them learn about sex and build up. So birth to age 2, we should be telling them correct names for body parts, including the really scary ones like clitoris or nipples or vagina or penis or vulva. Like, again, when we misname body parts or give them nicknames, it tells kids that there's something wrong or something weird about this body part that I'm not allowed to know the real name for, and I have to be like, oh, my whiz whacker, or I don't even know, like whatever weird things people say. So teach them correct names for body parts, and this just becomes really normal. One time my husband and I were babysitting for some like really close friends, and they had a 3-year-old and a 6-month-old baby. And my husband was changing the 6-month-old's diaper, and the 3-year-old was in the room. And he looks at my husband and he's just like, Nate, do you have a penis? And my husband's like, yep. And he's like, me too. And then just kept playing. Like, it was like, that is how common it should be. It's just like, you have fingers, you have toes, you have a penis, you have a vulva. And let's remember that vulva is the external genitalia and the vagina is internal genitalia. So we should be teaching our kids vulva if we're referring to external genitalia. So correct terminology for body parts. In what situations it's appropriate to touch your genitals. Body exploration, masturbation is really, really normal as kids. And we can just tell our kids like, hey, like, isn't that great that we get to explore our bodies? Let's just remember that if we want to touch our vulva, that we're in our room or in the bathroom somewhere private. Like, that's a private activity. And that doesn't need to have shame. 2 to 5 years old. And all of these things aren't like, oh, sweet, I talked about this when they were 2, so I won't talk about it again. Like, these are like, we're constantly like building, like, and these aren't like definitive. These are just like some guidelines. When your kid brings up things, you can talk to them about things. 2 to 5 years old, talking about consent. So letting kids know that they have control and have say over their bodies. So you don't have to touch anyone. What did I write there? Never touch someone else if they tell you not to. Oh, sorry, brain fart. So like if someone asks them to stop touching them, like poking them or pulling their hair, like no, if someone tells you to stop touching them, like you stop. Like we respect other people's bodies. You don't have to kiss or hug anyone you don't want to. If you don't want to hug grandma, you don't have to hug grandma, and that might be a conversation you have to have with your family and telling them how you're trying to teach their kid like respect and bodily autonomy, which can like maybe lead to conflict if your family doesn't understand, but I think it's worth it to show your kid that an adult will advocate for them and their body safety. And helping them understand that if someone touches them in a way that makes them feel uncomfortable or touches your penis or vulva, tell me or another adult you trust. Being like, we really can't prevent childhood abuse by like telling the kid to advocate for themselves because they're just in like a position of less power in those situations, but telling a kid that they can come to you if something happens is really important, and letting them see examples of when an adult will advocate for their body safety is really important. So these are things, none of these things have had to actually do with sex. These are just like body positivity, body, like knowledge about your body. What touch is appropriate, what touch is not appropriate. We talked about that a little. Who is allowed to see or touch your genitals, how babies are made. There's also a new idea I really like that talking about multiple ways that babies are made. So in like diverse family structures, like babies aren't always made. Like some couples, heterosexual couples can't get pregnant. So sometimes babies are made like in a test tube by taking like the seeds from mom and dad and like putting them together. Sometimes in like same-sex couples, like they can't make a baby because they don't have like the seed from a woman and a seed from a dad. So like they like have other people like help them. Like this conversation about diversity that we can tell kids like, hey, look, there's like diversity and not all babies are just made from like a married heterosexual couple. And there is a book on that I can't remember the name of, but I will try to find it. You can email me if you want that resource. Diverse family types, just being like, yeah, like sometimes there are two moms, sometimes there are two dads, sometimes there's a mom and a dad, sometimes there's a grandparent that is raising a kid, sometimes it's just a mom or just a dad, like talking about different family types and normalizing it so that kids know that it's not always just a heterosexual married couple. Body positivity, so telling a kid how awesome their bodies are and like helping them not be ashamed of their bodies, like my body is awesome, and not focusing on appearance, but focusing on like isn't it awesome that you have 3 like fingers that you can count on, or that you can like touch your tablet with, or you have eyes that you can see, or whatever body part that kids have that like they use to function, like celebrating that. Or like, isn't it great that you have a penis so that you can pee in the toilet? Like just like really simple things to give kids body positivity and like that isn't revolved around appearance, because our kids' self-esteem about their body shouldn't be based on their appearance. Gender identity, so kids, like gender identity is usually like consistently developed by age 4-ish. So like knowing if their gender identity matches their biological sex that they're born with. And so starting this conversation, if your kid if you're like suspecting like, oh, like maybe you don't feel like you're a boy even though you're like biologically male, like having this conversation with them. There's a really good video that I want to show on this topic that talks about it way better than I could, and we won't go too in depth here. But yeah, this is a really good video on gender identity with young kids.
How do I know if my kid is transgender? You may be wondering, if my son wears skirts all the time, could that mean he's gay or transgender? And what does it mean if my daughter doesn't want to be called a girl? The truth is that your child is who they are, and it's going to be okay. There's nothing you as a parent can do to change your kid's gender identity. While most people don't have a sense of their sexual orientation until middle or high school, children do start to understand their gender identity as early as 3 years old. Some little kids may understand that the gender everyone says they are is not who they really know they are inside, and that's the definition of transgender. For some kids, experimenting with their gender expression is just a phase or a personal preference. But for others, deep inside, they have a sense that boy or girl isn't the right category for them. So, how do you know if your kid is trying to tell you that they're transgender? Transgender kids tell you what their gender identity is in a way that's consistent. They don't go back and forth about their gender. They clearly identify with one particular gender identity. Insistent. They feel very strongly about their identity and get upset when they're told that they're not the gender they say they are. Persistent. How they identify themselves stays the same over time. If that sounds like your kid and you're not sure what to do, it can help to get some support. Talk with a counselor or therapist who's familiar with and supportive of transgender identities, or connect with other families with transgender kids. Letting your son do ballet or letting your daughter dress up as a male superhero for Halloween isn't going to make them transgender, but forcing them inside of a gender box that they don't fit into can hurt their self-esteem and body image, and hurt their relationship with you. They may even worry you don't love them, or that they can't be themselves around you. As always, the best thing you can do for your kid is listen to them, be there for them, and show them you love them just as they are. Want to learn more? Check out PlannedParenthood.org.
Okay. Also, along with that, like at this age, there's a lot of gender stereotyping, or what's the word? Like putting kids in gender boxes, like, oh, boys play with trucks and girls wear dresses, like letting them decide and give them like a wide range of activities so that they can choose how they want to like engage in activities rather than putting in them in a box based on their gender is really important at this age. Oh, we just watched that. Great. Okay, 6 to 8 years old, talking about if they're online and using the internet, like what digital safety looks like, talking about sexual abuse, just like continuing some of those things that we talked about with the younger kids, like come talk to us, mechanics of sex, maybe how babies are made, puberty, and it's important to talk about both sexes' puberty. Like if my kid is a girl, I don't only talk about periods, I also talk about like what boys go through during puberty. And that just eliminates like this like gender wars, like battle of the sexes thing that our culture seems to have when it comes to sex, like separating kids into like, oh, I'm a mom, so I'll talk to the daughter, you're a dad, so you talk to the son, like, or like we're two dads, we can't talk to our daughter about menstruation because we're not women. Like, there's no need for us to segregate based on gender. We can have these conversations that are fact-based about all genders. And there's a really sweet story I saw on Twitter about a girl who started her period at school and she bled through her pants, and one boy saw it like on the bus and he gave her his jacket and was like, hey, like you have some blood on your pants, like you can cover it up with my jacket if you want. Like if he wasn't educated about like what periods were, then like he wouldn't really have been able to help, or probably wouldn't feel comfortable like helping. But like there's no reason to withhold information about what other people are going through, and we can be supports for everybody. So talk about don't segregate by gender, talk to kids about everything. 9 to 12, talking about body changes are normal, like pubic hair is gonna grow, your boobs are gonna get bigger, your testicles are gonna like all like it's all normal. Like knowing that whatever's happening to your body, it's happening to somebody else's body, and it's all normal. You can talk to me about body changes if you like think something's not normal. I had a professor whose son came to him and he was like, hey, is it normal that one of my balls is hurting really bad? And he was like, oh, I don't know, like let's let's Google it together. And they found out that that could be like a sign of a bigger problem. So they went to the hospital, and if they hadn't have gone to the hospital within like a certain time, like certain hours, then this kid would have lost one of his testicles because it was like cutting off blood supply. But imagine if that kid didn't feel comfortable coming to his parents and asking him about things like, are testicles hurting? Normal. Talk to them about safe sex, STDs, pregnancy, like how, like when you can get pregnant, how it works, types of birth control, basics of how they work, sexting, digital safety, pornography. This is when kids are like getting more involved in things like that, or like are more likely to. And the HPV vaccine, ages 11 through 12, that can be a really good way to start talking. Not start talking because you've been talking since they were born, but like a good like conversation starter about HPV. 12 plus, ooh, that's going the other way. 12 plus years old, talking about sexual orientation, gender identity. So like you build the foundation about talking about these things by talking about diverse family structures and relationships, but and with gender identity too. But this is when like kids more like solidify their sexual orientation, and might be more aware of kids who might be expressing like a non-binary gender identity. So having continual conversations about that all the time. Personal beliefs and values about sex. This doesn't just have to be when they're 12 plus years old. You can talk about those the whole time. You could just maybe like get into some more specifics in adolescence than you would have with a 6-year-old. Talking about consent, we've laid the foundation for consent by talking about like body safety and listening to people like when they tell us to stop touching them. But like now, like what does consent look like at this age too? Like how is it building? Components of healthy relationships, STDs, being clear that every time you have vaginal, anal, or oral sex without a condom or dental dam, you're putting yourself at risk for STDs. STDs don't always have symptoms, and getting tested for STDs is really easy, and most STDs are treatable. So talk with your child early and often about a variety of sexual topics at age-appropriate levels. And there's lots of good information online if you're confused about if something might not be age-appropriate or not, but usually like your child will guide you. So pro tips, build the parent-child relationship and communication skills, just like in general. If it's hard to have conversations with your kid about topics that aren't sex, it might be harder for you to have conversations about sex. So spending time with your kid, doing something that they love with you can like build that relationship. Initiate conversations about sex early and often, like we talked about. So parents, like we said, like there's like this like reluctance to like start conversations from parents and kids. So as a parent, just start the conversation. And you can do this by using media to help engage in conversations and connect real life experiences. So like, oh, like that decision that those characters made in that show, like, what do you think about that? Do you think that was like a good choice? Why not? How does that fit in with our values? What could these people have done to be more like protect against STDs better? Did you see them talk about like consent before they started having sex in the show? It doesn't have to be like, if you're not watching sexy scenes together, you can talk about other things, but like there's just always media that your kid is probably already consuming that's reaching these topics, so might as well use that as like a conversation starter. Okay, so I love this. Meta communication is communicating about communication. So how are we communicating? Sometimes we might not react perfectly. If your kid comes up to you and asks you like what anal sex is, you might be like, oh, like I wasn't expecting this, and react like shocked, and then like shut it down just because you're feeling anxiety. You can have a repair attempt after and be like, hey, I'm sorry, I reacted poorly earlier. I was like not expecting that, and like I don't want you to feel like you can't like pop questions like this at me. I was just like in weird, like I just reacted out of anxiety. I really want you to know that you can't come to me with questions, and I want to answer your questions. Can we talk about it now? And like making that repair attempt after you may have reacted in like, or even like a shaming way, like, how do you know about that? Who told you about that? Like, you can repair. Talking about, like, if your kid is like, oh, mom, I don't want to talk to you about this. Like, this is horrible. Telling them why you think it's important that you talk about sex together. So, like, hey, it's important to me that you have the information you need about sex and relationships. That's why these conversations are important to me. And even saying, like, hey, is there anything that could make these conversations better for you? Because, like, I think it's so important that you're getting this information, but what can we do to make this, like, a helpful experience? If you don't know the answer to a question, like, hey, mom, how does chlamydia get, like, transferred to people? And you're like, oh my gosh, it's been so long since I learned that, or I never learned that. Like that's a great question. I don't really know. Can I do some research, get back to you tonight? Or even like, let's Google it together, see what happens, like see if we can find some good information from valid sources. Also could be a good like discussion about like what some valid sources might be. And then like we said, like what can we do, both of us, to like make these discussions more helpful or more comfortable. So meta communicating about this, like you can do it and it's helpful. Be there for your kids. We just did a study about asking kids about their experiences talking to their parents about sex, and like so many kids in our focus groups just talked about they wish their parents were there for them and were supportive. So these are quotes from our participants. You should have somebody there to support you no matter what kind of decision that you make. If it's wrong, okay, then we can fix it. Emotionally, I was just by myself and I didn't tell anybody how I felt about anybody. This participant is talking about her coming out as lesbian. So how she felt about anybody, like a attraction to another girl, because I was scared. And it doesn't have to be like that. You should have somebody there to support you no matter what kind of decision you make. I would not go to my mom if I had an STD, because she'd be like, well, how'd you get it? And it's like, how else did I get it, you know? And like, I don't want to say that to my mom, but at the same time, I need help, and that's the only person I can really go to. So being supportive is like such a big thing. And like, there is going to be anxieties and fears about what your kids' decisions are going to make, or what decisions your kids are going to make, but what kids really need is support. And I know that there are different value systems out there, and I want to be like, I'm not ever going to tell anyone what their value system should be. I just want to encourage you as a parent to understand that like your kid could be like, don't assume that your kid is going to have like a majority identity, like that they're going to be heterosexual or cisgender. You're sending messages all the time about like queer identities, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex. Like those messages are being sent as a parent, and if your kid does identify that way, like you could have already been sending negative messages about those groups when your kid does identify as that, which would make them feel lost and like they don't have a support system. So just be aware that your kid like might not be cisgender and straight, and to like be supportive starting from day one, instead of all of a sudden being like stopping talking bad about queer groups when your kid comes out. Like set up that foundation of support from the beginning. And I think you can do that regardless of your value system. I think there are ways that you can be supportive and loving and there for your kid, even if you might have like certain religious beliefs or values. So just something to think about. Here's a list of amazing resources for talking to your kids about sex. If you are Christian or Christianity is like an important value to you that you want to include in sexuality talks, nexttalk.org is a Christian organization that helps parents talk to their kids about sex within like a Christian value mindset. Giving the Talk on Instagram and Sex Positive Families also, actually I think all these have Instagrams probably, but Sex Positive Families and Giving the Talk on Instagram, highly recommend. So there's just some resources for you. So to wrap up, we're going to talk about school-based sex education, just briefly, not going into it too much, but I think this is a topic that people need to know about, and it does like relate to how we educate our kids about sex. So there's kind of two main camps of sex education in the US. There's abstinence-only education, which advocates for monogamous heterosexual marriage as the only appropriate context for sexual intercourse and the only certain way to avoid pregnancies, unwanted pregnancies, and sexually transmitted diseases. So these programs like really emphasize abstinence as the only option and don't make space for the reality that like people would actually choose to not be abstinent until marriage. And then there's comprehensive sex education programs that are more like talk about everything like birth control and STIs and see that there are other ways than just abstinence. And then there's some kind of like in between like abstinence focused comprehensive programs, but really the two main camps are like abstinence only and comprehensive from my understanding. Abstinence only programs are really not effective. Oh, sorry, that's my dog. Are really not effective at preventing unwanted pregnancies or STIs in like adolescence. And young adults and adolescents looking back on their sex education experience says that it's unrealistic. So abstinence only not only isn't giving kids the skills and tools that and knowledge that they need for when they do become sexually active, it's focused more on like values and like staying pure until marriage is some wording that's used sometimes, but it just doesn't talk about anything outside of that. So yeah, teens don't see it as realistic, and the evidence just isn't there that it's helping anything. And if we're focused so much on abstinence, we're probably not focusing on pleasure or what we can be doing to build the other realms of sexual health that we've talked about. In a study that me and some other colleagues did, there's a sample of, I think it was 30-something like 38 young adults talking about their sex ed experience. And from that sample, we found that these young adults wanted sex ed to address mental, relational, and emotional aspects of sex, present updated and realistic information, and they saw abstinence-only programs as unrealistic, provide basic information about sexuality, so they did want to know about like STDs and how sex works, cover diverse sexual behaviors and identities, so LGBTQ identities, actually just LGB, they didn't talk about transgender. And then sex ed should start earlier and be offered more often and be taught by trained instructors, not just like coaches. Should be taught by somebody that has like professional training in sexuality, according to these people. And I wanted to read some quotes from our participants because I think that for those of you who are like in late teens or early 20s can like connect with like your experience that happened most recently and like connect, and we all can connect on this. Like looking back, I feel like there are things we thought were good and maybe bad about like the sex ed we received in school, or maybe we didn't get any sex ed in school. But this is what our research found, and this is some quotes from our participants. I feel like the school should teach the emotional side as well as just like the penis and vagina, and this is what happens. The videos they used in my class were like from the 50s and 60s, so it was all just like a big joke. They need to use today's videos of what our parties today actually look like in high school. You can't be a grown adult and sit there and think that everyone in class is going to wait until marriage, especially when there's like a pregnant teenager in your class and they're telling her to wait. I mean, obviously it's not working whatever you're trying to do. You spend your whole high school years thinking about sex as this extremely negative thing, and it was good to hear someone, a podcast host of a podcast he was listening to, talk about it naturally instead of trying to treat you like you're a bad person for wanting to participate in it. Tell us how it really is. I don't think the health class should be a blow-off class like mine was. I think we should actually learn stuff in it because I was actually interested in it. That's what's going to make the world a better place without all the diseases and infections and kids with no parents and stuff like that. I think kids should learn about all kinds of sex because I know some of my friends who are gay and like didn't know any of it. Last semester was like, you can get an STD from having sex with a girl. And I was like, I didn't know that. So you can see from those quotes that like some idea of how young adults feel about their sex education experience. And if we're looking at these like markers of sexual health that we talked about before, giving people skills to talk effectively with other people, recognize risks, use healthcare services, set boundaries, feel comfortable with my body and sexuality. Abstinence-only education doesn't cover all the things that someone would need to make knowledgeable decisions about their sex life. So, comprehensive sex education for the win, in summary. So wrapping up, whatever your role is in socializing young people about sexuality, being able to provide messages that are free from shame, that give accurate information, that are open and supportive, like you can give those messages to kids who like need to hear normalizing things, or just hear an adult like be comfortable in their own skin and be comfortable talking about hard topics. So yeah, I think that by being educated and by working on our own anxieties and fears, we can socialize not only like younger people than us, but even like people who are our own peers with like sex positivity and less shame and fear around sex. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me, or you can always message me on Twitter. That's fine too. And yeah, that's all I got. Thanks so much for listening to me talk about this. And I will stop recording now.